Somewhere in the occupied Netherlands, on the night of the 22nd of November, 1944, a man walked out into the dark to do the one thing that was almost certain to get him killed. He was an agent, working behind German lines, and he was carrying a radio. In the Europe of that war, that sentence was usually the end of the story. For 4 years, in every occupied country on the continent, the most dangerous object a man could own was a transmitter. Not a gun, a radio, because the Germans could hear it. They had built a machine for listening, the best in the world, and it hunted men who keyed radios the way a dog hunts a scent. Stay on the air too long and they found you. First the country, then the city, then the street, then the room. Then the knock on the door and the wall. So every operator who lived did it the same way. Fast, in code. A short burst of Morse, a few minutes at the very most, and then off the air and gone because a few minutes was already pushing your luck. This man did none of that. He set the radio down, and he did not reach for a key because there was no key. He waited in the dark. And then he lifted a small box to his mouth, and he began to speak, out loud, in plain English, in an ordinary voice, the way you would talk to a man standing beside you. No code, no hurry. He talked for as long as he wanted to talk, and far above him in the freezing black, something was writing down every word. By every rule of the war he was living in, he had just signed his own death warrant. He had stayed on the air for many minutes. He had spoken in clear voice. He had done all the things the dead had done, and it was the safest thing he would do all year. Both of those things are true, and that is the part that is not supposed to make sense. The Germans never heard a word of it. We still have his voice on a spool of wire in an archive. We never kept his name. They called him Bobby. It is all we have. To understand why that night was a small miracle, you have to understand the thing it beat. And the thing it beat was not an army. It was a machine for listening. From the first months of the occupation, the Germans understood that the war in the shadows ran on radio. Every spy ring, every resistance cell, every agent dropped in by parachute was useless without one thing, a way to get what it learned back to London. And the only way to do that across occupied Europe was to broadcast it, to put it on the air, which meant that the entire secret war had a single, unavoidable weakness. And the Germans built an organization to live inside that weakness and kill the people who depended on it. It worked on a simple, patient principle. A radio transmitter does not send its signal to one place. It throws it out in every direction, across the land, and anyone with the right receiver can catch it. The Germans covered the occupied countries with listening stations, tuned across the shortwave bands where the clandestine sets lived. The moment an illegal transmitter came on the air, more than one of those stations would hear it. And once 2 or 3 of them had heard the same signal, they could each take a bearing on the direction it came from, and where those bearings crossed on a map was a box on the ground. The operator was somewhere inside that box. Then they closed it. They sent out vehicles, ordinary-looking vans with hidden loop antennas turning on the roof, and the vans drove the streets inside that box, listening to the signal grow stronger. Stronger meant closer. They narrowed it from a district to a block, from a block to a building. In the cruelest version of it, a man with a concealed set strapped to his body could walk the corridors of an apartment house and feel the signal swell until he was standing outside the right door. The operator almost never knew it was happening. He knew only that he had to be on the air on a schedule and that the longer he stayed, the worse his odds got. So, he raced the clock he could not see. He learned to send fast, to keep it short, to change locations, to transmit and vanish. Some lived for months that way. Many did not. The radio operator was the most hunted man in the resistance, and he knew it every single time he sat down to work. He was, in the phrase that has come down to us, a man living on borrowed time, and the bill always came due. And here is the trap that no amount of courage could get out of. Every trick the operators used was a way of buying time. Send faster, stay shorter, move more often. All of it bought minutes. None of it changed the fact underneath, which was that the signal still went out across the ground, in every direction, where the enemy was waiting to catch it. As long as that was true, the hunt could only be slowed. It could not be beaten. The operator was always, in the end, broadcasting his own location to the people who wanted him dead, and merely trying to do it quickly enough to get away before they arrived. You could give a man the best code in the world, and it did not matter, because the Germans did not need to read his message to kill him. They only needed to hear it. The code protected the secret. It did nothing at all to protect the man. He could send a string of perfect, unbreakable gibberish, and the vans would still find the door. That was the wall the whole secret war kept running into. The thing that made an agent valuable, his radio, was the same thing that got him caught. The better connected he was to London, the more he was on the air, and the more he was on the air, the sooner he died. There was no way around it that anyone had found in 4 years of trying. You accepted the risk, you sent fast, and you hoped. Unless you could change the one fact that everything else depended on. Unless you could build a radio that did not throw its voice across the ground at all. A radio the listening machine could not hear, no matter how long you stayed on it, no matter how slowly you spoke. That is what 2 Americans set out to build. And the way they did it was not to make a better version of the radio everyone already had. It was to throw away the part of it that was killing people. The work started late in 1942, inside the American Intelligence Service of the war, the Office of Strategic Services, the organization that would later grow into the CIA. 2 men are named for it. One was a civilian engineer from the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, named DeWitt Goddard, the kind of man who could build a thing with his hands as well as design it. The other was a naval officer attached to the OSS, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Simpson, an engineer in uniform. Between them, they took on a problem that 4 years of war had decided was simply the price of doing business. Their answer was strange, and the strangeness is the whole point. Everyone else had been trying to win the race against the listening machine. Send faster, hide better, run sooner. Goddard and Simpson did not try to win the race. They walked off the track. They asked a different question entirely, which was not how do we transmit without being caught, but why is the signal going where the enemy can hear it in the first place? Think about what an ordinary radio is built to do. It is built to be heard far away. That is its entire purpose. You want London to hear you from a cellar in Holland, so you throw the signal out as hard as you can, and on the shortwave bands everyone used it did something remarkable. It climbed into the upper air and rained back down across whole countries, reaching far over the horizon. Range was the goal. And range was exactly the thing that killed you, because a signal half of Europe could catch could certainly be caught by the van 2 streets over. So they built the opposite, on purpose. A radio with almost no reach across the ground at all, a set you could stand a few fields away from and never know was there. By every normal standard, that is a broken radio, a useless one. It was the single feature they wanted most. They got it by going where almost no clandestine set had gone, far up the dial to very high frequencies, around 260 million cycles a second. Up there, the physics changes. The signal stops bouncing around the world and starts behaving like a beam of light. It goes more or less straight, to the horizon and no further, and on the ground it dies within a few miles. Instead of a flare that lit up the whole countryside, they had built something closer to a flashlight pointed straight at the sky. Stand directly under it and you might catch it. Stand off to the side, where every German listening station in the country sat. And there was simply nothing there to hear. And the margin was a knife edge. When the designers learned that the Germans had a receiver that could sweep up to 250 million cycles, they pushed the system higher to 260, just over the top edge of what the enemy could hear. The whole secret lived in that sliver of a gap, 1 notch past the end of the German dial. But a radio with no ground range has an obvious problem. If it only reaches a few miles and only straight out to the horizon, who is going to receive it? Not a base in England, hundreds of miles away over the curve of the earth. The signal would never get there. So they put the listener in the sky. That was the second half of the idea, and it made the first half work. The agent's little radio did not have to reach England. It only had to reach an airplane flying high overhead, close enough to be inside that short range and high enough to have a clean line straight down to him. The signal went up, not out, up to one airplane in the dark and nowhere else. And once you have solved being heard, you no longer need to whisper in code. This is the part that must have felt like science fiction to anyone who had spent the war hunched over a Morse key with one eye on the door. The agent did not tap out signals. He talked, in plain voice. Because if the enemy physically cannot hear you, there is nothing left to hide. The whole system got a name out of the two halves of it. The handheld unit the agent carried, a little set weighing about 3.5 pounds, they called Joan. The larger unit that rode in the aircraft, paired with a machine that recorded everything onto a spool of steel wire, they called Eleanor. Joan and Eleanor. The story that has come down, and it is only a story, never nailed down in the official paper, is that the two names belong to two women the inventors knew. True or not, the name stuck, and the system has been Joan-Eleanor ever since. What it gave you, when it worked, was almost unfair. An agent no longer needed months of training in codes and ciphers because he did not use them. He spoke. The officer in the airplane could talk back, could ask him to slow down, to repeat, to explain, a real conversation across the front line instead of a one-way burst of dots and dashes fired blind into the night. The designers like to point out that 20 minutes of a man simply talking could carry more than 3 days of painstaking coded Morse. And the whole time, the most dangerous fact about being a radio operator, the signal spilling out across the ground, had quietly ceased to exist. They tested it through the summer of 1944, much of it at a field in England, working the bugs out, fighting the small, stubborn problems of antennas and drifting frequencies that come with any new machine. And then, in November, they took it to war over Holland, which is where we came in. So, picture the other end of that conversation. Picture the sky above Bobby on the night of the 22nd of November. The airplane up there was a de Havilland Mosquito, one of the strangest and best aircraft of the war. A fast, twin-engined machine built mostly of wood. The reconnaissance versions could climb very high and run from almost anything, and that is exactly what this job needed. An airplane that could sit deep over enemy territory at great height and simply not be caught. For this work, it flew up around 30,000 feet, at night, alone, and it circled. It went out over occupied land, found the patch of darkness where its agent was waiting, and it orbited there, holding station, while the conversation happened. Inside it, the man running the radio rode in a space the airplane had never been designed to carry a man in. The recording gear and the Eleanor set were fitted into a compartment in the back, the kind of bay meant to hold a camera, and the operator was folded in around it. Up at that altitude, the cabin was unpressurized and savagely cold, far below freezing, and he wore an oxygen mask to breathe the thin air and as much clothing as he could move in. And in that cramped, frozen, roaring little space, he put on a headset and listened, through the static and the engine noise, for one faint human voice rising up out of the blackness miles below. A voice belonging to a man he had very likely never met and would never see. When it came, he could answer it. That was the wonder of the thing. He was not just collecting a signal, he was holding a conversation. If the agent said something unclear, the officer could key his own set and ask. If a name or a number mattered, he could have it repeated until he was sure. The spool of wire turned and caught all of it, the agent's report and the questions and the answers, a recording an analyst could play back later, word for word, instead of trying to reconstruct meaning from a half-garbled string of Morse. A man on the ground in an occupied country, and a man in a freezing airplane 2,000 feet higher than most fighters could comfortably reach, were simply talking to each other. Across the most heavily policed airspace on Earth. And now, the question the whole story has been building toward. Why could the Germans not hear it? They had the finest radio interception service in the world. They had spent 4 years catching men exactly like Bobby. How did an agent stand in the open and talk, out loud, for many minutes and get away with it. Because everything about the listening machine was pointed the wrong way. The German service was built, top to bottom, to catch shortwave signals spreading out across the ground. Its receivers were tuned to those bands. Its stations were spaced across the countryside to take bearings on signals coming at them sideways, along the surface of the earth, from far off. That was the whole design. And Joan-Eleanor did not produce a signal like that. It produced a weak, very high-frequency signal that went almost straight up to an airplane and died within a few miles on the ground. It did not spread sideways. It did not travel far. It did not live on the bands they were sweeping. It was, to the machine built to hear it, on the wrong frequency, going in the wrong direction, at the wrong power, all at once. The vans could have driven directly underneath that conversation and heard nothing on their sets. The listening stations on the horizon were deaf to it. The most sophisticated radio hunt in the world, the apparatus that had put hundreds of operators against the wall, was not beaten by Joan-Eleanor. It was something worse than beaten. It never knew the conversation was taking place. As far as the surviving record shows, the Germans never detected a single Joan-Eleanor transmission for what it was. It is worth being careful with that word, undetectable, because nothing ever truly is, and history is full of people who were sure their signal was safe and were wrong. The honest way to say it is this. The system was designed to sit in a gap the Germans could not cover with the equipment and the methods they actually had, and there is no evidence they ever closed that gap before the war ended. For the men who used it, that distinction did not matter at all. What mattered was that the thing which had been killing agents for 4 years had, for them, simply stopped working. They could talk and live, which raised a new and tempting possibility. If a man could do this from occupied Holland, where there were at least friends and a resistance to hide among, then perhaps it could be done somewhere far worse, somewhere there were no friends at all. Holland was the proof. Germany was the real target. Everything about putting an agent into Germany itself, in the last winter of the war, was harder than the occupied countries had ever been. In Holland or France, an agent landed among a hostile population, yes, but also among people who might hide him, feed him, lie for him. There was a resistance to fall into. Inside Germany, there was none of that. There was a whole nation that, frightened or loyal or simply careful, would turn him in. Every stranger was a question. Every accent was a risk. A man dropped into the Reich was as alone as it is possible for a human being to be in the middle of millions of enemies, with no net under him of any kind. And yet they went. In the early months of 1945, the OSS began putting agents directly into Germany. Carried in at night and dropped by parachute from a fast attack bomber and a 26 invader, threading through the dark to put a man down inside the dying enemy heartland. And waiting to hear from them, high overhead, was the same system that had worked over Holland. There is a documented mission in the middle of March 1945 in which a Mosquito, holding station up around 25,000 feet near Berlin itself, made radio contact with agents who had been dropped into Germany days before. Men on the ground in the enemy capital region, and an airplane over the heart of the Reich, talking while the war ground toward its end. Now, here is the thing the radio did, stated plainly, and then the thing it could not do, because the difference between them is the whole truth of these missions. What Joan-Eleanor did, it did completely. It took the single deadliest part of an agent's life and erased it. The radio, which had been the one thing certain to get a man caught, was now the one thing that could not. He could report for as long as he needed, in his own voice, and the listening machine would never find him through it. On that one count, the agents going into Germany were safer than any clandestine operator of the previous 4 years. On every other count, they were in more danger than almost anyone alive. Because the radio only solved the radio. It did nothing about the rest of it. It could not give a man papers that would survive a hard inspection. It could not keep a frightened neighbor from reporting a stranger. It could not stop a checkpoint or a chance encounter with someone who knew the town he claimed to be from, or the simple grinding bad luck of being a foreign agent in a police state at war. Joan-Eleanor made a man's voice safe. It could do absolutely nothing to make the man safe, and the record is honest about what that meant. Of the teams the OSS sent into Germany in that final push, only a small fraction came back counted as real successes. The numbers that have come down suggest something like 1 in 8 or 9 actually delivered what was hoped, and the rest failed or were lost, or simply vanished into the chaos of a collapsing country. That figure is for the German operations broadly, not for the radio alone, but it tells you the shape of the thing. The communication system was close to miraculous. The work it served was still as close to suicidal as anything in the war. A perfect radio in the hand of a man whose every other minute was mortal danger. It is worth one moment on the kind of person who volunteered for that. To be dropped in the last weeks of the war into the homeland of the enemy, alone, carrying a little box and a list of times to stand in the dark and wait for an airplane that could hear you but could never help you, that could only listen and fly home. To gather what you could of an enemy in his death throes, speak it up into the night, and then go on surviving until the next window. Or not. These men are mostly code names to us now, if that. They went anyway, into the heart of the thing that wanted them dead. And what they sent up was real, and it mattered. From inside Germany, agents using this and other channels fed back the kind of intelligence that only a human being standing in the right street can get. What the bombing was actually hitting and what it was missing. Where things were moving. What was left of the enemy's strength and what was breaking. Voices out of the dark interior of a Reich that was supposed to be sealed, talking calmly to an airplane the people below could not hear and did not know was there. And when the war ended, all of it, the device and the missions and the men, went into a vault and the door closed. And it stayed closed for a very long time. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The agents who had survived came in from the cold. The Mosquitoes went to other work or to the scrapyard. The little Joan sets and the Eleanor recorders were gathered up, and the whole thing was filed away as one of the better-kept secrets of the war. And then it was not declassified for 31 years. Sit with that number, because it is longer than it sounds. The system was not let out into the open until 1976. A child born on the night Bobby spoke into the dark over Holland was a grown man in his 30s, with children of his own, before the government would even confirm that the thing his father might have built or flown or carried had existed at all. The war it was made for had been over for 3 decades. The country it was used against no longer existed. And still, the file stayed shut. Why hold a wartime radio secret for 31 years, long after the enemy it beat was gone? The honest answer is that the war it was built for ended, and another one started almost immediately, and the idea was just as good against the new enemy as it had been against the old one. The specific boxes became obsolete fast, as electronics always do, but the principle underneath them did not. A low-power voice link the other side cannot hear, beamed up to an aircraft instead of out across the ground, is exactly as useful for talking to your people behind a new iron curtain as it was for talking to them behind the old front line. The method was the treasure, not the hardware. So they locked up the method, and the method came wrapped around the names and the missions and the men. To protect the one, they buried the rest. There is a price to a secret kept that well, and the people who paid it were the ones who earned the thing in the first place. For 31 years, there was no credit to be had, because there was nothing anyone was allowed to say. The engineers who built a radio, the best listening service in the world, could not hear, got no public word of it for a generation. The men who flew the freezing orbits over enemy territory, the agents who carried Joan into the Reich, were not heroes of a known story, because there was no known story. By the time the door finally opened in 1976, a great deal had simply slipped away. Memories had faded, people had died, paper had been lost or never kept. And that is why, at the end of all this, we are left holding so little of the human part of it. We have the device, described down to the screws. We know the frequency it used and the weight of the set and the airplane that carried its partner. We have somewhere the actual recordings, The voices of agents on spools of wire, the literal sound of men reporting from inside an enemy country. What we mostly do not have is who they were. The man on the ground that first night is a codename Bobby, and the name behind the codename is gone. The men who built it are, in the open record, little more than a rank and a last name and a single brilliant idea. The agents who went into Germany are most of them not even that. It is a strange kind of monument. We kept the machine and lost the people. We have a perfect record of the voice they could not hear, and almost no record of the men who spoke it. The secret was kept so well and for so long that it outlasted the very memory of the people it was supposed to protect. So before they slip the rest of the way out of reach, it is worth going back to the one moment we can still see clearly. The dark field in Holland. The small box. The forbidden, ordinary sound of a man simply talking. Go back to the night of the 22nd of November, 1944. A man stands in a field in occupied Holland with a thing in his hand the size of a paperback, and he does the one act that 4 years of war had taught everyone was certain death. He stays on the air for many minutes. He speaks out loud, in plain voice, with no code to hide behind. He breaks every rule the dead had broken, and he lives precisely because of it. The most dangerous thing a man could do in that war, done his way, on his radio, was the safest thing he did all year. The forbidden act was the one that kept him alive. That is the whole story, standing in a dark field, talking to an airplane he cannot see while the machine built to hunt him hears nothing at all. We do not know what happened to him. We do not even know his name. We know that somewhere there is a spool of wire with his voice on it, calm in the dark, reporting, while a man 2,000 feet above the fighters listened and wrote it down and flew home. We know the names of the two who built the impossible radio only barely, an engineer from RCA and an officer of the Navy, a few facts and a brilliant idea and not much else. We know that other men carried that little box into the heart of Germany itself, alone, in the last winter of the war, and that many of them did not come back, and that we cannot tell you who most of them were. The reason we can tell you any of it at all is almost an accident. This sat locked in the dark until 1976, 31 years, and it would be sitting there still if someone had not finally opened the file. The whole record was sealed precisely so that no one would ever read it. Someone went back, against the entire point of the secret, and read it anyway. That is the only reason this story is not simply gone. So do the small thing the secret was built to prevent. Say one of them out loud. Not the machine, the man. The one who walked into a field behind enemy lines, did the single act that was supposed to kill him, spoke out loud into the dark, and lived to send his report home. He beat the best radio hunters in the world by refusing to be afraid of his own voice. And he has come down to us as nothing at all. A code name. Bobby. If you think a man like that deserves to be more than a code name in a file almost no one opens, say it here. Leave a mark so we know you came and you listened. And for one more day, the man who spoke out loud is not forgotten. They were easy to keep, these people. It only ever took someone deciding not to forget.